My name's Vanessa Lowe. I'm your host for Financing Philadelphia's Future. I believe this is like the 33rd episode, which is pretty amazing. This is sponsored by the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition and Neighborhood Networks. Like I said, 33 episodes. That's pretty cool. If you're joining us new, please set your screen for speaker view. That's the best way to watch. Using the icon on the top right of your screen. Enter questions in the chat, letting us know which section of the city you're from, West Mount Airy, East Mount Airy, etc. And if you want to join the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition, you can enter your email in the chat. So today's episode, we're going to be talking about pensions quite a bit. Now, we're going to have our usual half-hour episode, but then we're actually going to extend the conversation for an additional half hour. Maybe a little more, confusing topic. So why don't you give some people a little more time? But let's go ahead and jump right in, as this half hour goes quickly, as those of you who are regulars know. Let me start with a little update on what the coalition's been doing. We've continued to have our Financing Philadelphia's Futures, and we did some interviews with some of our new council people in the last several months. And one of the things we're going to talk about today, or the main thing we're going to talk about today, is the latest campaign that, again, supports, remember that legislation that was passed last year, creating the Philadelphia Public Financial Institution, Philadelphia Public Financing Authority. It has not been implemented, but we're pushing forward and we're going to make it happen. Now we have a new administration under Sherelle Parker, and the proposal that they're working on is under a category called Bring Our Money Home. And with Bring Our Money Home, one of the initiatives that they have now started to talk to the administration about is dedicating 2% of the Philadelphia City Pension Fund to what are called economically targeted investments. And so again, this is still under the categories of the original ideas of why we proposed the Philadelphia Public Bank. It's how do we support affordable housing, funding for disadvantaged businesses, funding for climate transition investments that are so needed now. So essentially saying, the people who live in the city and are, dependent on that pension fund, I think they would be happy. I hope they would be happy with, let's use some of those funds to actually help to support and maintain a stronger Philadelphia. And so now that we've brought up pensions, we can get to why we have our wonderful guest here today. Tom Sgouros is our guest. He is a public policy consultant and a fellow at the Policy Lab at Brown University, where he applies principles of data science to questions about pensions, public finance, and related issues. When he was senior policy advisor to the Rhode Island General Treasurer during 2015-2016, he helped establish the state's new infrastructure bank, created ways to invest the state's cash balance in local small businesses, and worked to improve the management of the state's liabilities. He's the author of the book entitled, I love the title, Checking the Banks, the Nuts and Bolts of Banking for People Who Want to Fix It. And he also writes law review articles about banking and abusive lending practices in the municipal bond market. Tom Sgouros, welcome, and I'll throw open the question of, with your expertise in pensions, what do you think of this latest initiatives of the Philadelphia Public Banking Authority to essentially ask for 2% dedicated funds from the city's pension fund?
I guess I should start by thanking you for the invitation to be here, and it is really one of the lovely things about helping people with public banking questions to encounter committed activists around the country who are interested in what is really sort of a nerdy but actually really important question of public policy. And it gets to the question that you're asking. One of the remarkable things about cities, governments in America in 2024 it is how wealthy they are, right? Even the cities that are thought of as broke are broke in that very special way of somebody who always has a few $100 million in the bank. Or or a couple of $1 billion in their pension fund. And the remarkable thing is that somehow, um, somehow we are persuaded to believe that cities in those positions can't actually do anything constructive with that money, that somehow it has to all be put in the bank. Um, that 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 it's safe for bankers to do something with that money, but it's not safe for the city to do something with that money. And to me, that has actually always seemed kind of nuts. Um, but I think that it's more than just me. People for years have been able to have found ways to use use fractions, small fractions of the pension fund to do constructive things, to make local investments. I mean, it's important to come up with things that are secure enough that you're not actually risking people's retirement in order to do them. But like, it turns out that that's actually not that it's not that hard. And if you think about it, the honest truth is that the bank that you're, that the city of Philadelphia is depositing its funds in, or the investment fund manager that the city is trusting their pension fund to, they are finding constructive uses for that money, and it is not at all a crazy thought to say, well, if you're finding investments to make with that money, why don't you find a few of them right here? And if there is a way to um, to package them and present them to the pension fund, then why not do that? I mean, this is people were doing this in the 1980s in California. CalPERS set up this whole little board whose function was to find and package local investment opportunities and present them to the CalPERS investment officers. CalPERS is um, the big pension fund in California. I mean, it's actually one of the biggest, maybe it's the biggest one in the world. Um, but that was something that they were doing in the 1980s, and lots of plans have been doing similar things since then. They, you know, sometimes those things are looked on as uh, dangerous or risky or charity. That's the one that always kind of gets me, is like, these are charitable things that they're doing because they're not making the 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 assumed rate of return that they uh, need for to meet their obligations. But the funny thing about that is that there actually are a whole range of rates of return that any investment portfolio encompasses, and it's not at all crazy to think that some of them should be at the higher end and riskier, and some of them should be at the lower end of returns, and for taking less risk. There's a range in there, and there's plenty of opportunities to find things to do with to make the city of Philadelphia's finances better.
Great,
The
great. Go ahead.
um, I think the somebody's asking a question about how local investments are subject to I know a guy kind of politics, and that there's corruption feasible there. There's two answers to that, I guess. One is that uh, one is that governance is an issue everywhere, and trying to run systems that are transparent and clean is not that much of a mystery. It is you can actually find ways to do this. People have found ways to do this. The CalPERS thing, the way they did it was they just established an arm's length relationship between the CalPERS board and this commission whose job it was to package these things. But but the funny thing about questions like that when they're framed this way is that they somehow presuppose that nothing like that happens in the private sector investment managers to which we entrust our money. Like, like honestly, do you really think that those investment managers don't actually do those things?
Right.
Somebody's asking what happened to the California Initiative, and the California Initiative was a initiative of Jerry Brown, and the answer there is that uh, he was succeeded by a governor, by a Republican governor who shut it down. Deukmejian, I think, was his name.
Yeah.
Um,
New York City has also implemented
yeah, I
ETI
mean,
investments. Yeah.
New York City has them. It's not an unusual thing. It's um, sometimes the unusual thing is to find ones with a long history because uh, if you are an investment manager, um, it's easier to select from a vast menu that you can enjoy when you are not geographically limited, right? It just makes your job easier when there are fewer restrictions on the things that you can invest in, and the uh, um, you know accepting constraints like that is something that you sort of object to, sort of on by nature somehow. But
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that those opportunities are not available.
Yeah. Yeah.
One uh, one thing that is uh, sort of gets at one of the critiques that I've been working on lately is that a lot of local investment opportunities have a good cash flow, but not as good prospects for capital appreciation. You might lend to somebody who is able to repay it, but one of the flaws of the way that we do the accounting for public pension plans is that unless it has capital appreciation, it's very hard for them to make it appear like they're doing something responsible, right? Which is a flaw of the accounting. It's not a flaw of the investment opportunity. And this is a real problem. I mean, if somebody tells you that, hey, you could invest in improvements to the Philadelphia water supply, for example. I don't actually know anything about the Philadelphia water supply. I'm just making this up. But utilities like water supply or electricity or something like that are famous for being totally reliable income uh, forever, right? So, and then you have a pension fund that needs totally reliable income forever, you know, and it is sort of a remarkable thing that somehow this totally reliable income is somehow deemed unsuitable for this totally reliable need for income. And and that is actually uh, that's part of my critique of how the accounting rules work. And we can get into that, but I'm not sure that this is the moment
Yeah.
for it.
Thank you, Tom. Let's have Peter, who is monitoring the chat. You don't need to worry about monitoring the chat. Peter, let's give us a question from the chat room.
Thanks, Vanessa. My question, I think you've addressed somewhat, Tom. Are local economically targeted investments inherently low rate of return or high risk to principal? For example, or specifically, can low income housing be an appropriate investment for the city pension funds?
Yeah, I'll I'm going to answer with a sort of a snarky answer, but it's sincere. One of the remarkable things about the American economy is how um, how much money there is that people routinely get from poor people. Like like it's it's kind of amazing the profit potential that is in managing slums. And I'm not suggesting that anybody go out there and manage a slum because it's a crude and awful thing to do. But there is reliable income available to the managers of affordable housing, and that is, I mean, people pay rent. Um, People pay rent and they do a lot to make sure that they continue to pay rent. And it's even more true when it's a place that they actually like. Um, so I don't think, there is an idea out there that these things are risky, but I don't think the track record actually bears that out when you look at it in terms of, the of the risk of default or the risk of not actually getting the income that you're anticipating. What there is an investment in housing is, I think, uh, like I was saying, something that is liable to get you a lot of reliable income, but is not necessarily, it's going to be, uh, you're going to have a reliable source of revenue, but you may not have a reliable source of capital appreciation. And because of the way the accounting systems work, um, the capital appreciation turns out to be thought of as important, even though it's not actually important to making the checks clear, right? It's important to making the system appear like it's in good shape, right? So that it's a there's a difference between how the accounting rules kind of portray a system and the bottom line reality of how do you actually make sure that the check's always clear.
Yeah, very good points. And I want to go back to the issue that you talked about yeah, I'm losing my train of thought, but let me go back to Peter because I think you had another question from the chat, Peter.
Oh, there's a question Stan Shapiro has put in asking, would changes in the accounting rules that you criticize likely require changes in state law?
Probably not, although I can't, there's a lot of crazy state laws out there in the world, and so I can't speak to the state of Pennsylvania and whether they have avoided all the crazy part. I mean, there are people who have put the assumed rate of return for a pension plan into state law. Like, really? Why do you, why is that a matter for legislators to argue about rather than like the pension board, But and yet it happens. So I can't speak to the details of Pennsylvania state law, but I can tell you that for the most part, the accounting rules are, what they call the generally accepted accounting principles. They are promulgated by a group called the Government Accounting Standards Board, and the GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, has made some decisions about public pensions that I think are pretty questionable. But I'm not the only one who thinks they're questionable. The ratings agencies, Standard and Poor's published quite a long, um, what do they call it? It's not an opinion. They call it a advisory, uh, advisory, I think, um, describing how they evaluate the health of a public pension plan. And when you read it, you realize, oh, what these guys are saying is that they feel like the GASB rules are actually inadequate to give you a good picture of what's going on. So they've actually published these advisories to explain the shortcomings of the accounting rules. And the accounting rules, I mean, GASB has no legal authority over the Philadelphia Pension Fund or any other pension fund. What they have is sort of moral authority, that we are making the rules that everybody is supposed to follow in their reporting. So I don't think it's a state law issue. I think it's more, that people will look at it and some people will say, oh gosh, that's terrible. You shouldn't be doing stuff like that because the rules make it look bad. Whereas, the reality, again, the point of a pension fund is to keep the checks from bouncing. The pension checks. Your job is to keep them from bouncing forever. And the goal really ought to be finding the least cost way to keep the checks from bouncing.
Tom, as a practical matter, are there investment advisors who would exist currently and that would be appropriate for packaging the kinds of investments that we're talking about for the pension fund to invest in, these local economically targeted investments?
I believe there are investment advisors that do that, but that's not really my world. What I'd suggest is that is roughly what you guys are doing. Trying to establish a finance authority to, to a finance authority to look in the city for important lending opportunities and, lending opportunities that really further important public policy goals, right?
Right.
And you're, finding ways to do that through through a Philadelphia public bank or a public finance agency, is actually one of the, that is potentially a way that a pension fund might responsibly invest in those kinds of things. I mean, you'd have there kind of an intermediary whose whose mission is to find those loans that produce, and whose mission also involves aggregating them to the size that a pension fund needs to do. I mean, I think people sometimes don't get also the like the manpower requirements of making investments. I mean, if you are an investment manager and you've got $8.5 billion to invest or whatever it is, then like you really don't want to hear about a $50,000 opportunity, right? I mean, there's just so many hours in the day. And I mean, how many people do you have to hire in order to invest $8.4 billion into 50,000 or 200,000 or $300,000 loans, right? It's not going to happen. You need some kind of intermediary to take those things and aggregate them into a scale that a multi-billion-dollar a multi-billion-dollar investment fund can actually get to. And
But
so
the legislation to establish the Philadelphia Public Financial Authority envision this role of being acting as a packager of investments, and perhaps as an investment bank, in effect, to put together uh, investment vehicles that would be suitable for the pension fund.
Mhm. And I think that's an excellent idea and exactly what the exactly what a finance agency like that should be doing.
Great. Tom, but I'm remembering the point you made about like any investment has different asset classes.
Mhm.
Do we know which class? So I'm involved with an endowment for my denomination, and
Mhm.
I manage what we call the community investing piece. And right now we are up to a 5% commitment. And so we use predominantly the cash bucket as opposed to, we're not going to sell our equities in order to invest in community investments. Do you know which bucket of assets or which sort of grouping is usually used then for those essentially community investments equivalent that we're talking about here?
Like the important thing about an investment is not just the risk and not just the return. There's also a question of liquidity, and yeah, I guess that's the other piece. Having uh, having something that's very liquid often requires you to sacrifice some yield, but that's actually important if um, that sometimes that's important to keep checks from bouncing, right? I mean, you'll tend to have some kind of liquid layer of your investment fund, and then some less liquid stuff and some even less liquid stuff underneath that. Things like hedge funds and private equity are supposedly wonderful investments. I mean, that is totally arguable, and it's not clear that's actually true. But assuming that it's true, what's not arguable is that they're very illiquid, right? You invest in these things for a decade, and even when you get to the end of the decade, sometimes the fund says, "Hey, we need to keep your money for 5 more years." Um, so these are not liquid investments, and so if you make your whole portfolio things that are so illiquid, then there's a good chance that you're going to be very unhappy someday. Um,
It's four.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Thank you. No, thank you for that. It's 4:55, so we got 5 more minutes that will be recorded. Um, Peter, do you have any more points, or should I want people to hear about the other components of the Bring Our Money Home campaign? Should we maybe throw those out now?
Yes, Vanessa, why don't you mention those other elements that we're also working on?
Okay, so the Bring Our Money Home campaign is also partnering with Power, Power Interfaith now they're called. We've gone statewide, and essentially have the campaign to focus on the faith-based institutions. And there's, I think, close to 50 in Philadelphia that are members, but statewide, I think we're about to 100 now, and encouraging and really sort of educating the faith-based institutions about the importance of moving their money from those large, national banks that are really not investing in ways that are probably helpful to our city, and bringing them home to either MDIs, minority depository institutions, or credit unions, or essentially any sort of local institutions here that are much more interested and invested in our community. And
And
the
who will think of those poor construction projects in Dubai that are going without the city's funds? Come on, Vanessa.
There you go.
Have you no compassion?
No compassion whatsoever. Yeah. So the pension piece, the faith-based piece, and then we think with the faith institution, it'll also trickle down to the members, the congregation members. So we're talking to them too. So it's a very exciting campaign. Do you want to add anything to that, Peter?
Yes, the other element that we're also looking for is to expand the designation of city depository institutions to include specifically minority depository institutions, which and to have support that role of the MDIs within the city financial ecosystem.
So yeah, great campaign, great campaign.
Yeah,
What are the questions? Go ahead.
those seem like really important goals to me.
Tom, what insights from your book will be helpful, as folks from, again, the Philadelphia Public Banking Authority are having meetings with council people, I believe, next week to, really uplift this idea and this request for 2%. And I think somebody put in the chat that the pension fund is now at about $8.2 billion. So it would be more than 160 million that would be then available to support city initiatives. Pretty cool. But yeah, any ideas from your book you want to share before we close this section?
I think the people, what will happen is people will say, "Oh, think of the risk," and what you have to remember is that banks are in the business of managing risk, and that there are many different ways to manage a risk. I think would be the thing to say. And banks typically in America manage, quote, manage, unquote, risk by basically trying to find somebody else to foist it onto, right? But that's not the only way to manage a risk, right? I mean, you can manage a risk by getting to know your borrowers, right? Getting to know your customers, working with customers, making sure that if somebody's in trouble, that there's a way to get to do some kind of workout plan. Like that's a way to manage a risk. Another way to manage a risk is just to find somebody stupider to take it, and like one of those has better economic consequences than the other one. And I guess what I'd encourage people to do when they think about public banks is realize that all banks are what banking really is managing risk, and what a public bank is really about is trying to manage it in a responsible way, and in a sense of not only responsible to the financial needs of the city, but also to the the economic needs of the people who live there.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great place to close out the sort of open session. We will turn off the videos and recording now, but everybody is welcome to stay and continue the conversation. We figured there might be a little, sort of humor questions and more dialogue after we turned off the cameras. But thank you for joining us. And what is it? It's every month, the last Tuesday of the month. Take care and have a good evening.